Hello, Capital H listeners, and welcome back to another episode from the Gartner Reimagine HR conference. Joining us for this episode is Chetan Jain, Deloitte's U.S. Human Capital HR transformation leader. He is responsible for 2,000 people around the globe who deliver HR transformation services to our clients. Chetan, welcome to Capital H.
Thank you so much, Kyle. So good to be here.
Awesome. Chetan, let's just start with a little bit of your background. You've been a Deloitte leader for 20 plus years. So share a little bit about your career journey. And also for those listeners who aren't familiar with our HR transformation practice, let them know what we do for our clients.
Absolutely. So I have about 27 years in the business. Majority of it has been spent in leading large-scale HR transformation programs, which includes all components of it: HR process design, operating model, redesign, implementation of technology solutions across different platforms,
Sure.
Change management and all of that.
Yep.
I've had the fortune of working with 50-odd Fortune 500 organizations in my career across industries. But what's most interesting about my background is I was born and raised in India. I moved here about 22 years ago, but I ran my dad's business full-time during my undergrad while I was studying.
Wow.
And I've learned so much from him. And the leader I am today is because of what I learned from him. I learned more from him than I did from my MBA in terms of how do we make sure that you're taking a customer-focused approach
Sure.
and taking care of your people. So I feel like that's been a huge part of how I show up as a leader.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you for sharing some of that story. And I think the ability to have led and worked in a family business brings a lot of insights to how you engage with customers. And then I know as we go through this episode, some of the insights that you've gained from working with 50 plus Fortune 500 clients, that's a tremendous wealth of knowledge. So we'll get into some of that today. So Chayton, share a little bit about our HR transformation practice. So for folks who aren't familiar, what is it that the practice does for organizations? And it's a practice that serves organizations of all sizes and scale: small enterprise, large enterprise, private, public, different industries and sectors. So share a little bit about what the team does.
Absolutely. So when you look at the HR transformation practice at Deloitte, to your point, it's about 2,300 people that we have within the practice. And we have had the privilege of being the leaders in the depth and breadth of HR transformation as ranked by analysts for over a decade.
Yeah.
This includes our strategy and advisory services relative to all things HR and payroll. So HR strategy, HR model design, process design, all components of it. We have very large practices, businesses focused on implementation capabilities with Oracle, Workday, SAP SuccessFactors, ServiceNow, as well as some of the payroll and workforce management technologies like UKG, Infor, Dayforce. And then we also have dabbled in net new emerging technologies that work at the intersection of talent and AI, like Eightfold, Paradox, Phenom, Moveworks. So incredibly exciting place to be. And then outside of that, we have the full-blown strategy, op model, implementation capabilities around payroll and workforce management.
Yeah.
Because we see a pretty significant demand relative to that as well.
Yeah.
So all things for the HR function, but also very heavily focused on the employee experience
Sure.
and the digital experience.
Yeah. Well, and ultimately tying back to some of the research we've done in our 2024 Human Capital Trends Report, delivering on those human outcomes tied to business outcomes for an enterprise that ultimately drive value for both. So, Chayton, one of the things, and thank you for grounding folks on the background of the practice. Today, you had the opportunity to share the stage at Gartner with a senior leader from Whirlpool, a client of Deloitte, who shared some of the story that Whirlpool has gone through in collaboration with Deloitte relative to an implementation, and knowing that an implementation is not the end, right? Once you implement, you have to operate, run the system, continue to focus on the business objectives tied to the transformation. And how can you then use that platform to innovate, right? And drive net new value that maybe wasn't originally thought about when the transformation journey started. Can you share a few highlights from the Whirlpool story that was discussed for the session today?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, it was such a great honor to share the stage with our client from Whirlpool. Whirlpool is such an iconic brand. And we were actually reminiscing about how Deloitte has been in the business for 180 years and Whirlpool has been in the business for 115 years.
Wow.
So iconic brand for so long. And they've actually had their own growth journey trajectory with mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, essentially, we've actually enjoyed like over a decade-long relationship with Whirlpool. The program started in 2014, and we've had the opportunity to work with Whirlpool around advise, implement, operate, and then to your point, innovating at every turn, really. And the HR organization at Whirlpool was incredibly progressive. One of the trends that we have in our Human Capital Trends report this year was the boundaryless HR.
Yep.
But I feel like Whirlpool was doing that even 10 years ago in terms of how HR was working across the business, always with the idea of meeting business objectives rather than HR just for HR's sake. So figuring out how to create a world-class employee experience, how to really meet business needs and anticipating what was yet to happen in the business and being the role model. HR was actually the role model for the rest of the enterprise in terms of how they led. So there was a full-blown HR operating model transformation. They also went through a case for change in terms of the future of HR, figuring that out, as well as the platform decisions. So they moved forward with SAP SuccessFactors for the core HR payroll platform, ServiceNow for case management, knowledge management, and then they had AD Docs for document management. This was all done in conjunction with setting up of a global shared services, and then 3 regional shared services centers as well. Figuring out a redefinition of the role of the HR business partner, having a lean HR operating model that would stand the test of time. And then over the years, they've done a lot of innovation around RPA. They have about 17 bots in and around their platforms to help automate repetitive tasks. They've invested in Eightfold, which is a great example of talent and AI in action. They're doing a lot of cool stuff with onboarding. So it's just a terrific story around how HR function has actually led the way for the enterprise at Whirlpool.
Yeah. Well, and what is really incredible about what you've just shared, right, is there was a journey to get the original foundation in place, right? That global and regional shared services model, changes to roles and responsibilities of other roles in the HR function, the SAP SuccessFactors core, right? And the Whirlpool team didn't rest on their laurels, right? Once that was done, it was let's stabilize. Let's make sure we're staying grounded in the workforce experience, employee experience. Are we driving business outcomes, anchored on those premises? And as new technology then comes along, what makes sense to explore and innovate and adopt? Where do you leverage existing tech stack versus add net new to ultimately, again, drive workforce value, human value, business value in new and different ways? So, Chayton, one of the things I think we've seen organizations grappling with is it almost feels like it's a continuous transformation journey now. Can you share a little bit about where you're seeing the balance of HR organizations, whether Whirlpool or otherwise, with delivering what's been asked, run the business, operate, while having the capacity to still change the business and transform and innovate?
Yeah, absolutely. And Kyle, just like you said, 2/3 of the Fortune 500 organizations have already migrated to some sort of a cloud platform. You can take your pick, whether it's Oracle, Workday, SAP SuccessFactors, a core platform is in place. So the question now is, how do we continue to get value out of those platforms? How do we optimize the value? And that's where this idea of consuming innovation at a rapid and sustainable pace becomes incredibly important. So go live is just day one, really. And then instead of resting on your laurels, how do you consume innovation? How do you develop muscle memory within the organization to be able to consume that innovation at a rapid pace? And really figuring out what does that future state org looks like. Each of the cloud providers that I mentioned have multiple releases a year. Some of them have 2 releases a year, Oracle has 4 releases a year. So how do you capitalize on the billions of dollars that are being invested on R&D to move and propel your function forward, really? And that's where we've come up with this equation where we talk about discrete investments that organizations need to make, whether it's coming from the HR budget, finance budget, IT budget. Essentially, of course, this idea of symphonic C-suite, boundaryless HR really comes into play there. And then how do you have sustainable business practices? So discrete investments plus sustainable business practices then leads to value realization for the HR function, but more importantly for the business.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that concept, Chayton, yesterday afternoon in a session that I had around boundaryless HR here at Gartner, the heads were nodding, right? It was this full agreement of the audience that there's no such thing as one and done anymore, right? But what is an acknowledgement is every single year, whether fiscal year, calendar year, performance year, there's going to be a new priority, whether for the function or for the business that gets asked, that turns into a one-time thing. There's your discrete investment, right? But there's this huge focus of saying, how do we make sure that one-time thing is not one and done, right? And that gets into your point around the sustainable practices, right? And so linking those two together to ultimately, to your point, realize value. And I know Jessica, Britton, Carrie, Bolt, other leaders have done some of that research with you and brought that story to life in our HR value realization series that folks can read into. So Chayton, I think here towards the end of 2024, we have started to see some of these kind of trends in the market, especially with the topic of AI around the C-suite and the board really wanting to understand how is the enterprise realizing the value of its investments, which is timely for this new equation. So can you speak a little bit about where do you see certain trends at the end of 2024 and what you might see as the focus for HR organizations, whether for the function or for the enterprise in 2025?
Yeah, absolutely. We are in the midst of a massive shift across workforce and workplace as we continue to see the integration of AI and advanced technologies, especially in the HR function. AI is definitely revolutionizing HR by automating repetitive tasks, enabling data-driven decision-making, enhancing talent acquisition processes, enhancing talent management as a function. As we look ahead, the future of HR will likely be characterized by increased digitalization.
Sure.
And HR playing a more strategic role in driving business outcomes. So when we think about HR professionals, they'll need to be agile, they need to be data savvy, they need to be hyper-connected, and then capable of leading change initiatives that align with organizational goals. So of course, we've already talked about the boundaryless HR, but the future of work requires HR to evolve from being a siloed function to a boundaryless discipline, integrated with people, business, and the community that it serves. And then, of course, we're also seeing the conversation shifting from productivity to unlocking human performance. So instead of the traditional focus on outputs, there's focus on human sustainability and human outcomes, really. We're also seeing a shift towards skills-based economy, where people are matched to work based on dynamic skills and interests rather than fixed roles. So as I think about looking ahead, the challenges that our clients face vary by industry. But of course, talent shortages continues to be a significant trend. Cost pressures, needing to do more with less, the supply chain disruptions, and HR can play a pivotal role in enabling organizations to stay ahead of this curve and thrive in the midst of these challenges. There's obviously significant focus on integrating workforce experience with technology. When you look at the workforce today, they have access to one-click opportunities, whether it's their banking app, whether it's on Amazon, and they're clamoring for such experiences at work. So they're expecting employers to provide that. And then finally, as we look ahead, just continued focus on how do HR organizations optimize the investment that they've made in HR technology.
Well, Chayton, I think you covered a fair bit, and some HR professionals might hear that and say, I've already got a lot on my plate, right? Some of those things you mentioned might already be there, some might not. How do I tackle more? And one of the things that we're chatting about here at Gartner is where some of the messaging is also, how do you make sure that you focus on the foundation or focus on the things that can immediately drive business value? And you have mentioned also this exploding interest in payroll and workforce management, which some folks might say, why payroll? Why workforce management, right? But ultimately, those are things that you as an organization need to get right because that's where employees, where workers don't want to see problems. So can you share a little bit about why payroll and workforce management has also become such a significant trend for what we're seeing at organizations?
Yeah. So when you think about payroll costs are typically number 2 and number 3 on the balance sheet for a CFO. So it's something that keeps everybody up at night. Nobody will ever thank you to pay them correctly. But as soon as someone's paycheck is wrong, someone will get a phone call, really. So it gets like a significant amount of attention. And there's a lot of focus on how do I reduce my payroll costs? How do I reduce the operational costs associated with running payroll? So a lot of our clients are grappling with that. While a lot of organizations have already done their HR op model transformations, clients are not quite there yet from a maturity scale perspective relative to payroll.
Okay.
Relative to their payroll function as well as relative to their payroll costs.
Okay.
Questions around in-source versus outsource keeps coming up. How should I design my payroll organization? How many people do I need to have? Should it be a part of finance? Should it be a part of HR? It always comes up. And then really figuring out like what platform are you going to use? Like all of the platforms that I talked about before have integrated payroll solutions with HR. So there's a lot of value that you can get out of it. But there's also cost-benefit analysis. And that's where you have to make insourcing versus outsourcing decisions. Now, coming to workforce management, the focus on frontline worker productivity is more than ever before. And to your point, they are the brand ambassadors of the organization. When you look at a healthcare organization, how a patient interacts with a nurse practitioner will drive the reputation of that healthcare organization.
Absolutely.
For a retail organization, how do I engage with my grocery clerk? How do I engage with the cashier at the register? Will be a defining moment, essentially. So there's a lot of focus on figuring out how can you make sure that the frontline workers are focused on serving clients, customers with distinction, rather than spending a lot of time with administrative activities. And outside of that, there's also a lot of issues relative to leakage, cost leakage in terms of overtime, double time, shift differentials, and all of that. So it's an opportunity for organizations to really assess their operational costs associated with payroll and workforce management. And this is where platforms like UKG, Infor, Dayforce, ADP can play a pretty pivotal role in figuring out an ideal future state for organizations, depending on their industry, depending on risk propensity. But that's where we are seeing a lot of demand currently coming from the CFO's office.
Chayton, thank you for sharing those insights relative to why payroll and workforce management has become such a top-of-mind topic for not only CHROs, but also CFOs, right? And just at the C-suite at large. I think given that, to your point, payroll, top 3 item on a balance sheet, anything that can be done to help executives address cost leakage, better manage the workforce in that ecosystem, full-time, part-time, contingent, digital, you name it, is going to be critical for what we've seen with organizations relative to the market at large, focusing more on margin, cash flow, certain other metrics. So, Chayton, I just want to say thank you for joining us here on the Capital H podcast at the Gartner Reimagine HR conference. I know there's been tremendous energy in the halls. We've seen a ton of organizations who are just really sharing their stories back and forth, inspiring others, knowing that there's a lot still to come in the journey ahead to drive impact for the function and for the enterprise. So any last parting thoughts for our listeners that you want to leave them with?
I would just say to all of the HR professionals listening out there, it's a great time to be in HR. It's a great time to be in the midst of driving evolution of the function from a boundaryless perspective, going from a siloed function to an integrated discipline with other parts of the business. So I wish everybody good luck and then look forward to coming on again.
Awesome. Thank you again, Chayton, for joining us on another episode from the Gartner Reimagine HR conference. Capital H listeners, stay tuned for more coming from the podcast as we continue to bring you market insights from events, research, and other areas at Deloitte that we're helping to bring stories forward to you all to continue to elevate the impact that you are driving within your functions, within your organizations, and in the workforce at large.
This podcast is produced by Deloitte. The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Deloitte. This podcast provides general information only and is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, please go to deloitte.com/about.